we're going to be reverse engineering the perfect exam strategy. We're going to go over the different types of questions. It's going to be topic number 1. Topic number 2, how to approach each one. And then topic number 3, we're going to be covering 3 different examples of exams and then how I would go about approaching these. Let's dive right into the different types of exam questions. So on a typical exam, there are MCQs, so multiple choice questions, short answer questions, and then there are LAQs, which are long answer questions. So for multiple choice questions, MCQs, I want to first focus on how to guess the answer if you don't know. For multiple choice questions, they're usually going to ask you in a few ways. There's going to be obviously like 4 to 5 different answers. This is going to give you, something to go off of at least, unlike the SAQs and the LAQs where you're not really going to have much to go off of. So this is kind of recognition rather than pure active recall. In the multiple choice questions, here are a couple things to keep in mind. 1, if 2 questions are exactly the opposite, one of them is usually right. The second thing to keep in mind is that for any words that are very strong, if they are included in one of the questions, it's unlikely that that question is going to be correct. So words like always or never or guaranteed, definitely, these words, if you encounter them, then they are unlikely to be in the correct answer. Words that have, let's say, like mostly, probably, most of the time you'll see likely. These words are not very definitive. And when you see them in a question, it is more likely that that question is right because it purposefully leaves room for error. If they weren't expecting you to think that it would happen most of the time, then they would just say it could. So that one is probably going to be correct. And then the final thing is that when you go through multiple choice questions, the worst feeling in the world is looking back and saying, oh man, I just changed my answer to the wrong one. How do you avoid this? Well, this is the way I do it, is that the first choice is always correct in my head. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually correct, but when I'm going about this, it is absolutely 100% actually the correct answer. And then second is if I go back, I have to prove this answer wrong. There's a lot more to choice than just conscious choice. There's actually a lot to be said for your subconscious, and your subconscious is responsible for a lot of physiological changes. So they actually did a study that was very, very interesting where a bunch of people were taking a test and they were relating, I believe it was different types of faces, but when they were choosing the wrong answer, the body actually produced the same physiological reaction as lying. Whenever you're going back, you don't have that initial gut reaction, right? You only know consciously what you're thinking. And so if you're relying on only conscious, think of this like an iceberg, right? So this is like under the water. There's actually a lot more subconscious than conscious. And so you want to rely mostly on your subconscious for the first choice. And, obviously you're going to do your best here. You just make the decision. But then when you go back, it's based only on the conscious. And so you are overcoming a much larger probability of it being correct. And so you have to be able to prove that wrong, because everything will seem correct when you go onto the exam and you take the test and you want to go back and fix your answers because you're not sure. Your gut is going to tell you something and it's going to increase the odds in your favor. Let's move on to short answer questions. Short answer questions, they're much more straightforward, but they kind of act like bullet points that you have to connect with filler words. The reason this is harder, I believe, than a long answer question is because you have to be way more succinct. You know how you try to write everything out and you're like, okay, maybe somewhere along the line I'll end up hitting the answer. You have space for that. Be succinct. For LAQs, which is long answer questions, I would argue is much easier to approach in more of a mind map sort of way. So I'll explain what this means after I go through all of these types of questions, and I'll show you how to make a mind map for it. So mind mapping, it's either going to be argumentative or persuasive. These are the 2 types of essays. So long answer questions are essentially essays. I want to talk about the mind mapping approach here for the LAQs. And honestly, it also works for the SAQs. I like to do something called the point spread. And this is essentially, you start at a point here and you go outward. And this is how you're going to structure an argument or persuasion. One of these two right here. So how does this work? What does point spread mean? And how can you use it to make really strong arguments? When you have a point, what is the point and what is the spread, right? We need to define what those two elements of this mind map are. The first element is the point, and this is going to be your topic. It's from the center. So essentially it's spreading outwards. The spread would be what comes after it. So this is the example that I like to give every time because it's very simple and people understand it. So the mitochondria, powerhouse of the cell, but your topic, let's say that the question asked something like, explain the role of the mitochondria, the role of the cell, and then how it differs from another organelle, which we also have to explain. These are the 4 components. We're going to hit them one by one. So the topic here, the point, this is going to be the cell, not the mitochondria, because the mitochondria is part of it. Then we're going to have the types of cells, so animal cells and plant cells. Obviously, there are different components of cells, so let's say that this is the organelle component. And then in the organelles here, we have mitochondria and we have chloroplasts. And then here, we have mitochondria. Now that we've made this mind map, and this is how I would study it, I wouldn't necessarily write this out on the exam. It takes too much time, but you should understand at a fundamental level that this is going to be the structure of your argument when you're writing short answer or long answer questions. Your response would be something like the mitochondria. So start by addressing, right, the role, right? This would be number 1, is define it, and organelle, and that hits this part here. So you're actually kind of going back. So this would be 4, this would be 3, this would be 2, and this would be 1. And it would also look the same here. So these would both be 4. This would be 3. This would be 2. And this would be 1. So when you're thinking from the topic, that's the order 1, 2, 3, 4. But when you're making your argument, you go 4, 3, 2, 1. So the mitochondria is an organelle. And so we just covered mitochondria. We covered organelles. And then we have types of cells. So in which cell is it in? Animal and plant cells. And then we have to explain how it's different, right, from the organelles of plant cells. Whatever the question is asking, the role of the mitochondria, right, you first have to define what the thing is. And then you go and say it's in the cell and it's different from the other stuff. And then you can say its role. So mitochondria is an organelle in both animal and plant cells. Its role, or the role of the mitochondria, we'll just say for simplicity's sake here, because I don't feel like defining all of it, it's to be the powerhouse. Now you've defined the characteristics, so that was part 5 here. Now you have to define how it's different from the organelles of plant cells. Unlike the chloroplast, and you'd also have to define this too, and then say which is only present plant cells, ... explain how they're different here. And that is how you would go about building a mind map to form an argument for the SAQs and the LAQs. It's much more just hitting bullet points. And then for the LAQs, you would want to expand after this. So obviously you have this here, but you also want to, add your own thoughts because you're supporting your argument. You're either making an argument, right? So you're not just saying the facts, but you're giving your own interpretation, or you're trying to persuade someone that your idea is correct. So that's what comes after this, would be like your beliefs, your understanding of the topic, that sort of thing. So for only MCQ exams, a very structured way of doing this because it keeps my ADHD brain from just running all over the place. I actually go through it twice. I don't go through it once. And I know you might be thinking, okay, I have to go through this more than one time, right? But multiple choice is really tricky in that they try to phrase the questions in a way that's going to make you make a mistake because they're already giving you a list of answers. And so there's only two ways you can mess up. One, you can misunderstand the question. And the second way is that you just don't know the content. The not knowing the content is solved by studying better, which I've covered extensively in other videos, but I will also cover in later live streams. I'm planning on doing several hours today. So stick around because I might, answer a lot of your questions. And if you have any more questions, drop them in the chat because I will be looking through that and just blazing through as many as possible after I get through this topic. So the way that you go about solving misunderstanding the question is what I call back, front, back. You go through the test 2 times. The first time, trial 1, it goes like this. You go back to front, and this part is crucial that you write it on the Scantron only. Why is that so important? The reason for this, well, I guess it makes sense actually if I would explain it after this next step. So we'll cover that in a sec. And the second time that you go is front to back. And this one is done on the test booklet only. So why do I do it this way? Why do I order it this way? It could be done anyway. Why this? Well, first of all, when you go from back to front, most of the time, the professors are going to order the questions in a way that goes from the least or the furthest recent material, the least recent material, to the most recent material. So odds are you have not spent as much time studying the types of questions or the content for the last few weeks of the semester. So you've had less time with it, and therefore you should spend extra energy and focus on it when you have more energy, which is first, because it will likely be at the back of the test. So you go back to front. Why do you do, well, also on the beginning of the test, they usually give you a couple gimmies. And so a gimme is basically like a very easy question that they expect you to be able to ask. A lot of the time it's been like for my, one of my biology courses, it was like what is ecology? And it's like so simple, but like I guarantee like half of the people got it wrong because they just didn't make that a flashcard, and they're just like, it's so simple, it's too easy to study. But those are the types of questions that would be like maybe the first or second on the exam. But because they're easier, it means you don't need as much energy. And so you go from the hardest question when you have the most energy to the easiest question when you have the least amount of energy. And it looks something like this. This is something that I call snowballing. So this curve represents how difficult it is for you to complete a task. And when you start with the small things, the easier things, and you go to the larger things, I think it's very easy to tell that it's going to be a lot harder to push this snowball up the hill when it's steeper. In contrast, when you start with the harder thing and it gets easier, the perceived effort might be harder in the beginning, but it remains almost constant over time because things get exponentially harder, but it gets exponentially smaller as well, exponentially easier, or the types of questions get easier. So that's what I refer to as reverse snowballing. So after you've gone back to front, which is what I recommend you do first, you do it only in the Scantron sheet. Why only in the Scantron sheet? 2 reasons. One, because you don't want your annotations and your choice that you can see when you go back through it again to influence what answer you decide to choose the second time, because you're going to have a lot of bias if you just write it all on the same page and then you reread over everything you've done. You're like, oh yeah, I got that right. Yeah, I got that right. You're going to get something called confirmation bias, which is where you're looking for why your answer is correct instead of evaluating the whole question again without bias. Obviously, you're going to remember some of what you put the first time, but it's going to be a lot less. So it's a way of minimizing the amount of bias that you have. Now, why do I have you do it in the Scantron sheet? The second reason is because you don't want to run out of time. And I've made this mistake many times where I've done it in the booklet first and then scrambled to write it down in the Scantron sheet when I got to the end. Horrible. It's much better if you just write it in the Scantron sheet the first time. You blaze through it. You just base everything on instinct, like I explained earlier about the subconscious and the conscious. You have that boost of subconscious when you're going through the first time in your initial reaction, whereas you don't when you try to reevaluate entirely consciously the second time. It's much better to get everything down on the page so that if time runs out, you can just hand it in and you're only left with the fact that you just haven't gone through the whole second time, but it's on the booklet, so it doesn't matter. You don't have to fill anything in, right? You're not being graded on that. You just didn't get to review maybe the last like third of the test. It's a much better way of staying calm, because if you do it the other way first, you're going to be scrambling and you're going to be worried about what to write in the Scantron. Do I put the right answer or the second answer that I got? No, you just already have all the first answers. They're there, and then you have to prove them wrong because, again, like I explained earlier, you're only evaluating with conscious, so everything will seem right. You have to be able to prove your initial answer wrong. So those are the two reasons why I recommend doing on the Scantron sheet only. Then the second time, you go front to back. You're going to start with the easier questions. I would honestly recommend taking maybe like a 2-3 minute break between. It's going to seem like you're just wasting time. But the reality is your brain has a very limited amount of energy. And there's something called synaptic depletion. So in your brain, you have all of these neurons, right? Blah, 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 blah. That's a neuron. There's its axon. There's the axon terminal branches. And then you have more neurons like this and axon terminal branches. Okay, this is neuron 1. This is neuron 2. For this part right here, you can barely see that, but imagine we're zooming in now, so it looks like this here. And they're passing along different neurotransmitters. So the flow is going this way. This is N2. This is N1. Okay. So when you pass along neurotransmitters, which are the chemical signals that allow neurons to communicate, you get to a point, there's something called synaptic depletion. And synaptic depletion basically means that you run out of these neurotransmitters over time and you can't produce as much signaling. Oop. Sorry about that. Okay. And you can't produce as much signaling. This is what mental fatigue is short term. It's a form of habituation, if you want to think of it like that too, where you just stop responding to the same stimulus as much. So to avoid that, take a break. This is all to say scientific reason for why you take a break. Yes, this is called the synapse right here. So it might seem like a waste of time, but if you don't do this, you just continually deplete. You need to give your brain a little bit of time to recharge. And it's kind of like a battery. So imagine a phone battery when you're recharging. It actually recharges a lot faster from 0 to like 50 or to like 80 than it does from 80 to 100. Not because it does that thing where it like waits until it expects you to pick up your phone in the morning and then like boosts up the rest of the charge. The reason is because if you were to have two containers, one container is here, one container is here, you have a ton of stuff here. So let's say this whole thing is the phone battery, and to recharge you need to get all of these little dots over here, right? And it's completely full. There's a ton of them. Well, at first it's very easy to just shove these things in here because there's not as many, but over time when it gets more full, there's less and less room, and it's harder and harder to pack those things in. So going from say 80 to 100% battery would actually take you almost as much energy as going from like 20 to, I'm just making these numbers up, but like 20 to 80, right? Just way more energy. So like what you, well, I'm not going to explain what chargers do. It's just a whole other thing. But this is basically to say, in those 3 minutes, your brain can actually recover a lot. But another 3 minutes after that, it's diminishing returns. So you don't actually need like a 30-minute break. A 3-minute break will do fine to get you through the second half of the test. And plus, it might be further than half of the way through the test because you spent most of the cognitive energy doing this the first time. And then the second half is just review. You've already pre-exposed yourself to it, so you have that mental priming effect, and it's going to be easier. So I'm just going to erase this real quick, just so we have more room here. That is how I'd recommend going through a multiple choice question, or a multiple choice exam. Back to front, front to back, Scantron first, booklet second. When you don't have matching answers, so if answers don't match, pretty simple, just accept the first choice as correct and prove it wrong to change answer. If you can't think of a reason why it's wrong, don't change it. You're probably just going to be changing to the incorrect answer. It's not enough to think that the other answer is correct because it will all seem correct. You can probably justify all of them in some sense. That's actually not something that you do during this. So the question for anybody who can't see the chat is about LAQs and SAQs in the exam. The time is limited and there are more questions. So how can we do it faster? The whole mind mapping process. You don't actually do the mind mapping part in the exam. That would be how you would study structuring the information. So I would recommend having a few topics that you cover that would make for good mind maps. So in biology, you could do something like geology, like the carbon cycle, maybe. And then maybe you have one for the nitrogen cycle, and then the phosphorus cycle, and then weather patterns, and then climates, and then perhaps cells, right? You could even do one separately for animal and plant cells, right? And you just practice breaking this information apart because it's going to really help with the speed. You don't want to have to recreate this on the exam. You want to have it in your head so you can just kind of regurgitate it. And then, you can do a lot during the exam, a lot of processing and figuring things out along the way, but you want to at least have the framework there. So that is for MCQ exams. Now let's move on to SAQs plus MCQs. How do we go about approaching this? The first thing that I forgot to mention for the multiple choice questions is the fact that you should always do a brain dump, a complete brain dump of everything that you think that you're going to forget as soon as you get into the exam. There is a lot to be said for how much you can shove into short-term memory. Your goal is to not forget that. So write it down on a scrap sheet of paper. If you don't have a scrap sheet of paper, then write it down in the margins, because even if you will remember it, you don't want to have to use the cognitive energy to recreate that memory while you're going through the test. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of energy. It's much easier to just write it down. A lot of the time, even if I know what something means, I will literally write down the simplest definition that I have memorized. And then when I'm asked to define it later, I don't have to think about, oh, how do I define this? Like, oh, I think it's probably something like, it's like, no, I have the answer. Here it is. Blah, 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 blah. I just rewrite it, right? You don't want to have to do all of that stuff. So very powerful tool. Write things down in the margins. And before the exam, I have my whole 1 hour pre-exam protocol. It's free. It's a free PDF. You can go download it on UofTearless.com. But essentially part of that is maximizing short-term memory. So before I go into the exam, I will look at all the questions, all the topics. Usually they're only like 5 or 6. Like maybe it's like a list of things, like 5 or 6 lists of things. I'll make acronyms for them, memorize those acronyms, and go into the exam and write them down as soon as I get there. I don't write my name down on the scan sheet. I don't fill out any of the bubbles. I literally, the first thing that I do when I sit down is I just brain dump all of this. I don't even look at the questions. I don't even look at if I need it, because it will help and serve as a memory cue. If it's not needed, it's still good to have as much information about the course as possible there, because it can trigger other memories. So a memory cue essentially is something that helps you remember a certain memory. But a lot of the time we encode all of these things in a similar context, right? We're learning everything in the same classroom, so they're connected that way. But they're also similar topics because it's the same course. And so the more information about a topic you can get in front of you, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to fill in the rest of that information. Because what happens is you trigger an engram, and an engram is essentially a group of cells, a group of neurons that a memory has been mapped onto. So imagine it's like you're like, okay, this is a horrible example because memory is not at all like a video recording, but let's say you just had a video recording, you uploaded it to the cloud, and then your job is to like download it again, right? That would be the recall part. It's, you know, when you activate the engram, that's essentially the programming in the computer that tells it to download the memory from your storage. So the more of those cues you can get, right? It's like it's a stimulus which triggers the response, which lights up. It's like plugging in a Christmas tree, right? You put in the teeny little plug and then the whole thing lights up. And then you're like, oh my gosh, that's a Christmas tree, not a normal tree. Right? You're seeing it in the dark. You're like, oh, it's just a normal like pine tree. No, it's a Christmas tree. Now you can see that it's lights, right? Now that you've plugged it in. That's kind of like that. So you want as much stuff there as possible. So let's move into MCQs and LEQs, that type of exam. How do you go through this? Sorry, there's one more question. Wouldn't it be good to, like, before approaching the question, to make a few points about the answer and how I'm going to write quickly to make this structured? Yeah, you're getting ahead of me here. So I'm about to go into my strategy for that. So multiple choice and short answer, what do you do? Pretty much exactly what you just said, actually. So the first thing I do, right? So we have the brain dump. And then you go into the SAQs. You will, this is, I'll usually on a scrap sheet of paper just write down the number of the question, and then everything I can remember that relates to that, bullet points, definitions, anything that will help me answer that question. I don't format it in any way. I literally just write down as much as possible on a scrap sheet. Again, if you don't scrap sheet, you can just make teeny bullet points in the margins to not try to take up as much space as possible. So you'll plan SAQs. Then third, you will go back to front, MCQs, and then you will go SAQs. You will actually write the SAQs, so actually write. And then if you have time, you can go front to back MCQs. That is how I would approach the MCQs and the SAQs. Now let's move on to the third type of exam, which is MCQs plus SAQs plus LAQs. The first thing that I would always do is brain dump. Then plan out the SAQs. Plan the LAQs. Why do I have you plan the SAQs first? Well, the reason is because it covers more topics. And the more you can think about more topics, the easier it's going to be to think in depth about one. And while it is probably not the same topic as an SAQ, you are more likely to, again, retrieve the information if there's a greater context to draw from. So that's why I always recommend doing the SAQs first. It will help with the brain dump. You're essentially brain dumping even more. And then the LAQs, you need to be a lot more structured in your planning. You can't just write random garbage. I would at least attempt to plan in order of the way you're going to write it. Okay, then fourth, you're going to do the MCQs. You're going to go back to front. Fifth, you're going to write the LAQs. Why write the LAQs? Because it's that big snowball. It's what takes a lot of mental energy, and it's worth the most points. And you want to be able to think very clearly so you don't end up rambling and write way more pages than you need to. You want to be able to keep it succinct, because the SAQs will force you to be succinct because there's not a lot of space. But the LAQs, you have a lot more freedom to write as much as you want. But you need to be clear. I promise you, if you write a bunch of mumbo jumbo, the TA will get very frustrated. I have a lot of friends who are TAs, and they hate it when students just write a bunch of garbage hoping that the answer's in there. And a lot of the time, they will just mark the answer as wrong because it's too hard to find the points that they're looking for, even if it might be in there and just not explained well. So it's more important to be clear and not write a lot than it is to try to write, 3 pages and hope that your answer is in there somewhere. So write the LAQs. Then number 6, write the SAQs. This honestly is where I would recommend taking a tiny break. 2 to 3 min break. This dash here just means minute. Okay, write SAQs, and then if you have time, you go front to back MCQs, and that is it. Boom. So we just covered all 3 ways, all 3 different types of exams. So MCQs and SAQs, MCQs, SAQs, and LAQs, and then how to argue with the mind map here. So that is how I would go about attacking all 3 of these types of exams. It really honestly just comes down to, how the speed at which you can do this comes down to how well you know the information and how well you prepared. But that is a whole nother video. I'm going to answer questions, so I'm going to look in the chat and make sure that I'm not missing anything that people have asked questions about. We're just planning the start. Yes. The first part of an exam, honestly, I would probably spend, I would say 5 minutes brain dumping and then 5 minutes just planning, because it's going to make a world of difference in terms of like how much you can actually remember. But you don't want to spend too long to where you're just eating up time where you could be answering questions. So 5 minutes for the planning, and then, 5 minutes for the brain dump, 5 to 10 minutes for planning, because if you have LAQs, odds are your exam is no less than 2 hours. So you do have a little bit of time. If it's only long answer questions, just plan and write. If it's only short answer and long answer, start with the SAQs planning, do the LAQs planning, then write the LAQs, then write the SAQs. Worst comes to worst, you don't finish one of the LAQs rather than not finishing one of the SAQs rather than not finishing one of the LAQs, which are worth way more points. So it's much better. That's how I recommend doing it. All right, any more questions? Our exam is 3 hours. Consists of all types of questions, so how much time should it take? Okay, perfect. If your exam is 3 hours, I would spend 5 minutes, or actually even 10 minutes brain dumping, and then another 10 to 15 minutes planning, and then start writing. If your exam is 3 hours, I'm assuming it's probably going to, if it has all different types, I'm assuming it's going to be 1 to 2 long answer questions, probably 2, 4 to 5, probably 5 short answer questions, and 15 to 20, probably 15 multiple choice. If that's the case, then that is what I would do. 10 minutes of brain dumping. That includes, by the way, filling out your name and student number and all of that on the Scantron sheet and on the test booklet. But that should only take like a couple of minutes. And then spend 10 minutes planning, 10 to 15 minutes planning. So this question is, what do you do when the professor gives you a paragraph from the textbook and then asks a few questions on the topic. Just make sure that you've gone through the content of the textbook. It depends on the prof, obviously, whether you read the textbook or not. Like sometimes it's optional, but if it's not technically optional, I would always recommend reading the textbook and at least doing all of the practice questions and speed reading through it if it's pretty similar to the class content. The reason for this is because a lot of the time the profs will pull questions from old exams or from the book, or from the practice questions that they give you. So always make sure that you do all of that, because you can get a couple of freebies on that. But I would honestly recommend, if you're reading the textbook, just like focus on the questions. A lot of the time too, on YouTube, this is incredibly important that I think a lot of people should know. For the majority of textbooks, if you look up the name of the textbook, odds are somebody has if it's a famous textbook, odds are somebody has created a playlist answering all of the textbook questions. And it will save you so much time and so much headache trying to figure out if your answer is correct by using like AI or something, or just not being able to figure it out and, you know, not knowing where to go after you answer the question because the answers either aren't there or weren't provided, or were somewhat unclear on how to get the answer. If you want my full pre-exam protocol, then you can download that for free at UofTearless.com, in addition to a bunch of other free resources that will help you with procrastination, burnout, focus. I've answered it in PDF format, and 2 of them have free audiobooks too. So have at it.